A New Mexico Pueblo is using DNA testing to prove its ties to Chaco Canyon in an effort to better protect.
Pueblo Bonito was several stories high. This architectural phenomenon took decades and even centuries to build.
Deep in the hot, dry desert of the American Southwest, cut into canyon walls and spread across 1,000 square miles of reddish rock, there are buildings that have been empty for 800 years. Perfectly built walls, 5 stories high, lined up with the stars, and completely deserted. School books will tell you that a civilization disappeared here. A quiet, peaceful group of farmers who created one of the most advanced cultures in North America before the Europeans arrived, and who simply walked away around 1200 AD. For 150 years, that was the accepted story, a mystery with no solution. Then scientists pulled ancient DNA from the bones those people left behind. When the results came back, nearly everything in the school books turned out to be wrong. The Anasazi were never who we were told they were. And even more surprising, they never actually disappeared. What the DNA revealed is stranger than any simple vanishing act. And the answer has been right in front of us the whole time. To understand what the DNA overturned, you first need to know what it was overturning. That means going back to a civilization that, for close to 3 centuries, was the most advanced society anywhere north of Mexico. Chaco Canyon sits in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico. It is a shallow cut of sandstone about 9 miles long, surrounded by empty land. There is no big river nearby, no green valley, no obvious reason why anyone would build anything there at all. And yet between roughly 900 AD and 1150 AD, it became the political, religious, and architectural heart of a civilization that covered more than 90,000 square miles, and an area bigger than the entire country of Ireland. The people there built great houses, more than 150 of them, enormous stone buildings rising up to 5 stories, some containing over 600 rooms, built to a standard that modern builders still find hard to copy. The rooms were arranged to follow the movements of the sun and moon across cycles lasting many years. At least one carved rock marking tracked the exact moment of the summer solstice to within a few minutes. A system of roads, some of them 30 feet wide, ran in perfectly straight lines across the landscape for hundreds of miles. These roads climbed straight up cliff faces rather than going around them. They were built to make a statement, not simply to move goods from place to place. At the heart of it all were the kivas, round sunken ceremonial rooms built into every great house. Some were small, others could hold hundreds of people. These were the sacred gathering spaces where whatever held this civilization together was renewed, generation after generation, for nearly 300 years. By every standard you can measure, Chaco was extraordinary. And then, around 1200 AD, it ended, not slowly. The great houses were abandoned within just a few generations. The roads went quiet. The people who had built all of this simply walked away and left everything standing. Empty walls, ceremonial rooms full of sacred objects, all deserted. For a long time, this was one of the greatest mysteries in American archaeology. The answer that found its way into textbooks throughout the 20th century was a comforting one. A peaceful farming civilization, democratic and equal. People who lived in harmony with the land and with each other, who eventually scattered into the wider desert and faded from history. They were given a name borrowed from the Navajo language, Anasazi, though many archaeologists today prefer the term ancestral Puebloans. The story had a neat shape. A civilization rose. A civilization vanished. Here are the ruins they left behind. The problem is that nearly every part of that story was built before anyone could read what the bones were actually saying. Before ancient DNA analysis existed, the textbook version of the Anasazi was built from pottery, buildings, and a great deal of wishful thinking. It was a story written in the absence of the most important evidence. When that evidence finally arrived, pulled from bones that had been sitting in museum storage for a century, it did not gently update the textbook. It knocked it apart completely. Ancient DNA analysis allows scientists to take genetic material from skeletal remains hundreds or thousands of years old, compare it with the genes of living people today, and build a detailed picture of who those people were and where they came from. It is, in every real sense, a time machine made of bone. The first major study at Pueblo Bonito, the grandest great house in the canyon, produced a finding that should have ended the peaceful, equal society story on its own. The individuals buried in room 33, one of the highest status chambers in the building, were not a random cross-section of Chacoan society. They were closely related through the female line, across 9 generations. This was a ruling family that had buried its dead in the same room. It in the same great house for more than 300 years. Thousands of pieces of turquoise conch shell trumpets from the Pacific coast. These were not the graves of equal citizens in a democratic farming community. These were the tombs of a hereditary ruling class. The textbooks had described a people without rulers. The DNA described a dynasty. But it was the second finding that truly shook the field. When researchers compared the broader Chacoan genetic profile to surrounding populations, something did not add up. The ancestral Puebloans of the wider region shared a clear, consistent genetic pattern going back thousands of years. But at Chaco Canyon itself, especially among the elite burials, there were additional genetic signals that did not match the surrounding populations. Signals that appeared to have entered the Chacoan gene pool from somewhere else entirely, somewhere far outside the Southwest. Someone had come from far away, and whoever it was had gone straight to the top of the ruling class. In archaeology, this kind of genetic break almost always points to migration, a new population arriving, a new power structure being set up, and the timing, concentrated in burials from the 9th through 12th centuries, lined up exactly with the period when Chaco Canyon was transforming from a scattering of simple pit house villages into the most ambitious building project in prehistoric North America. The obvious question followed. Where had these people come from? The researchers looked south. They looked at the trade goods that had started showing up in Chaco around this time. Macaw feathers from tropical Mexico, copper bells made using a metalworking tradition from Mesoamerica, traces of cacao found in ceremonial vessels through chemical testing, a plant that grows only in the tropics, more than 1,000 miles away. The genetic trail and the physical evidence trail pointed in the same direction, towards central Mexico. To understand what the DNA was pointing at, you have to understand what was happening 1,000 miles to the south in the centuries before Chaco reached its peak. The Valley of Mexico, in the 9th century, was a world falling apart. Teotihuacan, once the largest city in the Americas, had collapsed. The Maya were entering a crisis that would empty their cities within 100 years. Power was fracturing, populations were moving, and the religious and political traditions of Mesoamerica, yet with their blood rituals and their priest kings, were searching for new ground. Around the same time, Chaco Canyon began to change in ways that left unmistakable fingerprints. At Wupatki, on the western edge of the Chacoan world, archaeologists found a Mesoamerican ball court. Not something similar to one, but an actual ball court of the kind used for ritual games played across Mexico for more than 1,000 years. There was no local tradition that could explain how one appeared in the Arizona high desert. It had been brought there. Inside Chaco Canyon itself, at the great house called Chetro Kettle, a row of columns was built along a central wall, exactly matching the architectural style of Mesoamerican temples, hundreds of miles to the south. No one else in the Southwest was building anything like it. At some point later, someone filled the columns in, as if the signature had become uncomfortable. But the original construction was unmistakable. Then came the teeth. In the ceremonial heart of Pueblo Bonito, among the elite burials that had already revealed the ruling family bloodline, researchers found a single filed tooth, a specific style of dental modification common across Mesoamerica and completely unknown anywhere in the Southwest, the Great Basin, or the Great Plains. There was no tradition of modifying teeth north of Mexico, none at all. And yet there it was in the grave of a high-status Chacoan individual, a signature that could only have been carried north by someone born and raised in Mesoamerica. The genetic data confirmed what the dental evidence suggested. Yet the unusual signals in the Chacoan elite burials lined up with populations from central Mexico. Not a mass migration, but a small, concentrated presence placed directly at the highest levels of the most powerful great house in the canyon. a picture was coming together. Around 900 AD, a small group of people from the collapsing Mesoamerican world traveled north. They arrived at Chaco Canyon with knowledge of architecture, astronomy, and religion. Within a few generations, Chaco transformed from a modest farming settlement into an organized, priest-run center with great houses, road systems, ceremonial chambers, and a ruling dynasty that would hold power for nearly 3 centuries. Based on the strength of the genetic signal, it was likely a small group, perhaps a few dozen people, perhaps a single founding family. But whatever their number, they had not come as equals. They established themselves at the top of the existing social structure and built something completely new on top of it. A peaceful, equal farming community does not transform itself overnight into a coordinated, priest-ruled society with monumental buildings. The design at Chaco looked increasingly like a smaller, northern version of the Mesoamerican model. A ruling class with specialized knowledge, a religious hierarchy, ceremonies tied to the movements of the sky, the full movements of the sky, massive construction as an expression of cosmic order. But the Mesoamerican model came with something else, something that most researchers had been unwilling to name out loud, because what these people brought with them was not just buildings and astronomy. It was a religion that required blood. For most of the 20th century, one physical anthropologist stood almost alone in trying to explain what the Chacoan bones were actually showing. His name was Christy Turner. He had trained as a forensic consultant, working with police on homicide cases. He knew what human bones looked like when treated gently after death, and he knew what they looked like when treated as something else entirely. When he examined skeletal collections from Chaco Canyon and the surrounding great houses, he saw a pattern that did not fit the peaceful farmer story at all. The bones had been processed, not buried or cremated, but dismembered, broken, burned, and scattered. The damage on them matched, with disturbing precision, the damage seen on animals that had been butchered for food. Turner built a forensic checklist over decades of work. He had at least 6 specific signs had to be present before he would conclude that a set of bones showed evidence of cannibalism. The signs included burning on the back of skulls but not the face, scraping marks from bones being smashed to extract marrow, cut marks from stone tools at tendon attachment points, a fine polish left on bone fragments stirred inside ceramic cooking pots, fracture patterns consistent with fresh rather than dry bone, and most damning of all, the systematic absence of vertebrae, the richest source of marrow in the body, which had been completely crushed and removed from nearly every processed collection. Applied to the Chacoan material, the checklist produced results the field could not dismiss. Turner and his colleagues identified nearly 300 individuals across dozens of Chacoan sites whose remains met all the criteria. Men, women, children, and infants all processed in exactly the same way Chacoan hunters processed deer and rabbits. Many researchers still argued that processing did not prove eating. The gap between butchering and actual consumption was where the debate lived for over 20 years. That gap closed in 1997 at a site called Cowboy Wash in southwestern Colorado. Excavators found the remains of 7 individuals processed according to all 6 of Turner's criteria. And in the hearth at the center of the dwelling, next to the cooking vessels, they found a coprolite, preserved human feces, dried out and kept intact by the desert climate, deposited at the scene of the processing. A biochemist named Richard Marlar tested the coprolite for a single specific protein called human myoglobin. Myoglobin exists only in skeletal muscle. It is not found anywhere else in the human body, and it is not produced by eating plants or animals. The only way human myoglobin can appear in human feces is if one person has eaten the skeletal muscle of another. Marlar ran the test 6 times with every possible control in place. Every result came back positive. Cannibalism at Cowboy Wash was no longer a theory. It was a biochemical fact. And once that evidence was accepted, the broader Chacoan pattern fell into place. Roughly 1 in 50 skeletal remains from the Chacoan world showed the full forensic signature. 90% of the processed remains were found in or near Chacuan ceremonial centers. The cannibalism signature appeared in the record almost exactly when Chaco rose, and it disappeared almost exactly when Chaco fell. The pattern was too specific to be a coincidence. Now, this was not the signature of starvation or warfare, it was the signature of something organized. What emerged from years of careful research was a theory that combined the genetic, architectural, dental, and forensic evidence into a single picture. A small group had arrived from the collapsing Mesoamerican world sometime in the late 9th century. They had brought with them the ball courts, the colonnaded buildings, the astronomical knowledge, and a religion in which the universe required blood to keep functioning. A religion in which the consumption of human flesh, performed by priests and declared necessary by cosmic forces, was the ultimate demonstration of power over other human beings. In the Valley of Mexico, this had been the foundation of social control for 1,000 years. Elite priests ate the bodies of sacrificed captives. Yes, the ceremony was public. The message was clear. Anyone who resisted the system would become the next offering. Transported to the American Southwest, this model did not need a large population of believers. It only needed a small, ruthless elite and a local population frightened enough to comply. The Anasazi in this reading were not the cannibals. They were the subjects. The population held in place for nearly 3 centuries by a ruling class that had imported a system of religious terror from 1,000 miles away. The forensic record does not show communities routinely eating their dead. It shows concentrated, catastrophic events. Entire families processed in a single night. Bodies cut apart with ceremonial precision and left in the ceremonial rooms of great houses, where everyone in the region would know what had happened and understand the warning it carried. A campaign of terror requires relatively few victims to control a population of thousands. The threat did not need to be carried out often. It only needed to be believable. It needs to be said clearly that the Pueblo descendant communities, including the Hopi, the Zuni, the Acoma, and the Rio Grande Pueblos, have challenged this interpretation for decades. They have correctly pointed out that cannibalism accusations have been used throughout American history to dehumanize Native peoples. They have argued that forensic evidence cannot reconstruct the meaning of what it records, and they have insisted that whatever happened at Chaco happened to their ancestors not because of them. That distinction matters, and the evidence itself supports exactly that framing. What the descendant communities have said all along, and what the DNA now appears to confirm, is that the cannibalism at Chaco was not a feature of Puebloan culture. It was a feature of what had been done to Puebloan culture by an imported ruling class using a borrowed religion to maintain power for 2.5 centuries. The Chacoan world was not built on agreement. It was held together by fear, and fear, as every civilization that has ever depended on it eventually discovers, has an expiration date. Around 1150 AD, that date arrived. The collapse did not come from a single direction. Tree ring analysis, which allows researchers to reconstruct rainfall year by year, going back more than 1,000 years, and it shows that the warming trend supporting Chacuan farming for 3 centuries broke down in the middle of the 12th century. Between roughly 1130 and 1180 AD, the Southwest entered a long drought. Winters became colder, summers drier. The rainfall that had allowed Chacuan farmers to grow corn in soils that should never have supported it began failing season after season in a pattern that lasted long enough to destroy the agricultural foundation of the entire system. Chaco had always been vulnerable to this. The canyon had no reliable water supply. The great houses had been sustained by a coordinated effort to move food from the outer regions into the ritual core. When the outer regions could no longer produce extra food, the ritual core lost the ability to feed itself. The tribute stopped. The coordination fell apart. And then, the cannibalism signature, present in the record for more than 200 years, essentially stopped appearing after 1180 AD. The system that had produced those remains for a quarter of a millennium simply ceased to function. Whether the local population rose up against the ruling elite, whether the priests lost the religious authority that had kept the system running, or whether the entire structure dissolved under the pressure of a failing food supply, the record cannot say for certain. What it can say is that within a few decades of the drought's arrival, the great houses were being abandoned, not burned or destroyed, simply left. By 1200 AD, the emptying of the canyon was well underway. By 1300, the entire Four Corners region was effectively empty of human habitation. This is the moment the textbook story settles on. The vanishing, the mystery, the lost civilization. And this is where that story has always been wrong, because the emptying of Chaco was not a disappearance. It was a migration. The people who had lived under the Chacoan system did not vanish into the desert. They moved south and east, following the rivers that still ran along the Rio Grande and the Little Colorado, down to the mesas and fertile valleys where farming was still possible. They carried with them their knowledge of agriculture, astronomy, and building, and they left behind the ceremonial centers of a system that had apparently stopped being worth preserving. For more than 6 centuries, the story of where those people went was told only in the oral traditions of their descendants, traditions that the academic world largely refused to treat as real evidence. What ancient DNA has now done, through a series of studies completed over the last decade, is confirm what those oral traditions had been saying all along. The Anasazi did not vanish. Their descendants have been living in plain sight the entire time. A civilization was called lost, while its descendants farmed the same valleys, performed the same ceremonies, and carried in their bodies the exact biological record of the ones who had built the great houses. The oral traditions told the story accurately for 800 years. The archaeologists simply refused to listen. Ancient DNA did not rediscover the Anasazi. It confirmed what had never actually been forgotten, except by the people who came later and decided the story needed an ending. The real mystery of the American Southwest is not what happened to the people who built Chaco Canyon. It is how long it took the rest of us to notice they were still here.